Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Red Menace. So on today's episode, we are going to have a sort of free-flowing, organic conversation about something that has been in the news a lot lately and has been in a lot of people's mind lately, and I think is, gaining steam with regards to the discussions around it. And unfortunately, I think, these discussions we're going to be talking about related to artificial intelligence, are often discussed in very narrow ways that, in mainstream discourse, take capitalism for granted and, take this idea that these things are sort of good in their own right or abstract away from the material conditions in which they manifest. And I hope this conversation with Alyson can be a sort of kind of corrective to some of that, as well as going deeper on the philosophical side of some of the things that artificial intelligence, artificial general intelligence, etc., implies about our possible futures, about who we are as conscious beings, about consciousness itself. And so I think we can have a really interesting, wide-ranging conversation on this that you don't often get in mainstream discourse. So hopefully we can provide something of insight here. But I think the best way to start this conversation about artificial intelligence is to let Alyson kind of put the main pieces on the table, explain the basics of what the discourse is about, the basic, technological parameters that we're operating within, and then we'll let the discussion sort of take a life of its own.
Yeah, so to kind of start very big picture, I think everyone listening to this probably has some idea of what artificial intelligence is at this point because, kind of with a shocking level of speed, it has integrated itself into daily life fairly quickly. Over the last few years, we've seen massive developments within artificial intelligence, GPT-3, and now the GPT-4 models, various different imaging models as well, such as DALL-E, have come up. There is this massive expansion of technological investment into artificial intelligence that now is really starting to kind of pay off in terms of output. We have concrete uses that we can use for it. You can use it to make images. You can use it to write documents for you. We are really at the point where we're starting to see it kind of emerge as a social phenomenon, not just as something that is being researched. And obviously, along with that comes a whole host of political and ethical concerns that I think we're going to get into. Broadly, I want to set the stage a little bit by just doing a bit of definitional work. So most of what is called artificial intelligence today are LLMs, large language models, which are a particular type of artificial intelligence that can process a huge data set ahead of time. It can process multiple things in parallel. And the big kind of breakthrough with LLMs is that the way it approaches the words in the data set, it can kind of understand the meaning of words and the context of other words, which is a kind of big breakthrough, and that is really what's new with a lot of these LLM models. So given a bunch of training data, an LLM will be able to respond to various prompts in ways that that make sense within the context of the words it's responding to. So if you ask it to give you a document including specific things, it doesn't just understand the words in your prompt, it understands them relationally to other words. This is kind of the core idea, and then is able to construct a response where those relations are baked into it. So again, if you've ever played around with like old chatbots, I don't know if anyone else used like AI instant messenger or America Online Instant Messenger back in the day, but there were like really bad chatbots on there, right? And those could not handle a really complicated request. They could give very basic responses to text input. They could mimic human speech, but they couldn't really synthesize things together. And LLMs are actually capable of doing that. If you go to ChatGPT and you say, this is my work experience, can you put together a cover letter for me? It'll be able to extrapolate beyond what you've given it and actually synthesize some information in between. Now, that synthesis isn't it actually knowing anything about you and your work information. It's a complex neural relationship between the words you've given it and other words that it knows are statistically likely to occur in relation to them. But it's pretty, it does a good job of looking like intelligible speech, actually, if you've ever played with these tools. So these are the kind of large form of AI that we are seeing now breaking out. And the other term that we use when we talk about AI that I think is relevant is AGI, or artificial general intelligence. Artificial general intelligence, there are actually like a lot of competing definitions about what that might mean, but this is more about the kind of sci-fi notion of AI that you think about, which is like a fully independent thinking machine that doesn't require necessarily training data, but actually is able to think independently, take in information on its own, of its own volition, and then synthesize new information based on that. LLMs are decidedly not this yet. You have to feed in a specific set of training data, and it can only work based on the training data that it has. So there is a gap between AGI and LLMs. But broadly, when we talk about like a synthetic consciousness, a consciousness that is purely computational, what people are talking about is AGI. And so, that's all just kind of big picture definitional work, but I think that's important for us to understand where we're at now and what sort of concerns we might have about the future of AI. So AI is already, just with the LLM models, I think, being very disruptive in society in ways that are really important to think about. And people have concerns about it becoming this bigger AGI that might pose existential threats to humanity. But as it already is, I think we can see a huge impact that is happening now. AI is making huge inroads into the advertising field, which is actually kind of ruining the internet in various ways. A huge amount of the content on the internet that is SEO, so search engine optimized, is written by AIs just to pop up high on a page on Google and get ads to you. This has already fundamentally disrupted the usefulness of search engines. More and more images that we are seeing online are AI generated. We now have, demos coming out from OpenAI for video AI, which some of it is very impressive, and that will absolutely create disruption socially. Deepfake image video editing has developed because of AI, in which people have made really horrific applications of creating pornography where they impose the faces of other people into existing videos, stuff like that. The social disruption is already here with the existing AI models that we have. So, again, there's these two dimensions, existing models and AGI. I think the existing models are what we most need to be worried about at the moment, and they are already causing massive problems. One other place that I'm going to say that they are causing disruptions already that are worth kind of wrestling with is I also think people overhype what they're capable of. So LLMs are really good at giving you the text that you expect them to give you back, but that's not the same thing as intelligence, right? But we're already seeing all of these tech startups saying, oh, we're going to replace doctors with LLMs for poor people who can't afford doctors, right? And that is based on the faulty idea that an LLM is actually reasoning or thinking and could do diagnostic work. But it can't. It just knows statistical probability on what words it needs to return to you. So I think the other social disruption is going to be gutting access to human knowledge that is necessary in specific fields, again, like medicine, and replacing it with LLMs that have been overhyped about what they can do, and that will probably lead to further disruption. So broadly, this is why I think these talks about AI matter. It's already integrating into our society. It's already integrating into our society under the control of some of the worst tech startup people you've ever heard of, unfortunately, and it's already causing disruption based on that we, as not people who are in these CEO tech startup positions, don't get any input in, and that is where a lot of these concerns come from.
Yeah, so one thing there's to say is to think deeply about the a previous era of techno-optimism, and that is the 90s and the build up to, well, the internet's online now, more people are getting on, the invention of the sort of the personal computer, and then the invention of social media. As these things were coming online, there was a sort of very deep naivete from on the part of its proponents or people who believed in what was happening, that this is just going to be a wholly sort of good thing, that social media is going to connect people from around the world. After the Arab Spring, for example, there was like a boost in this sort of techno-utopianism, like, this is going to like topple authoritarian governments and people are going to be able to express themselves in new ways, and none of the negative sides that we're all starting to become very accustomed to were ever sort of seen and predicted, and that's happened in every iteration of technological development. And so we should also think incredibly deeply about the techno-utopians that are pushing these new ideas on us, promising us all of these wonderful things, but we, as communists, as Marxists, we understand we live in very specific material conditions and in a very, ossified and stratified class society. And any new technological injection into that highly unequal society is not going to produce utopia, but is, going to be used to reinforce class rule and is going to have a bunch of downstream consequences that certainly its advocates and even many of its skeptics aren't even fully aware of and can't articulate yet. So we should always have a baseline skepticism on that front. I'm no expert in this realm by any means, but I've been doing some research, and there's a current issue with these large language models and even these artificial intelligent image generators, which is there seems to be a sort of narrowing over time of syntactic diversity in the large language models and diversity of images when it comes to artificially intelligent image generation. And it's sort of this sort of techno-inbreeding problem where AI itself starts using AI images as its raw material sources, and it sort of narrows the final product. For example, I was looking at a collage of elephants, right? There's a bunch of real pictures of elephants in the wild that are pumped into the database for artificial intelligence. And then this is a big collage, right? And then there's a big collage of what comes out the other end. And over time, the images of elephants become more and more narrow, and the collage of artificially intelligent generated images of elephants look like they're all more or less the same. And the actual diversity exists in the real stock photos of elephants in the wild. Now, that's probably an overcomable problem, but if we're jumping into things like, like Alyson was saying, with using these large language models in the context of like medical advice specifically for people who can't access healthcare, well, that's an issue we should definitely, think very deeply about before we unleash it in that way. One of the things that sort of shocked me, and, I'm maybe easily impressed here, but the latest version of ChatGPT, I was just messing around on it, and I'm somewhat a public figure, but not really. Nobody knows who the fuck I am. But I typed in well, what would Brett O'Shea from Rev Left Radio say about modern American society? And it just fucking nailed it. Everything I would say, it said. And I thought that was kind of cool, and sort of I was telling my friends about it, and that's kind of crazy, But there is this sense in which these large language models have, in a lot of ways, passed the Turing test, which used to be this threshold for believability with regards to these technologies. The Turing test was held up as this really important threshold, and that seems to already have been blown out of the water and is not that impressive. So I think that's kind of interesting. But the thing I really want to focus on at this moment, and we'll get into class society, automation, basic income, contradictions, etc. here in a second. But you mentioned something about the Silicon Valley Techno-Cult, as I would call it.
Yeah.
And we have to think very deeply about this class formation that is the sort of basis of this technological innovation and progress, and we have to see these people as deeply embedded not only in their own material conditions, not only in their own echo chambers, but in a neoliberal subjectivity. The people that create these technologies, they are really high on their own supply. They believe that they are these Ayn Randian, almost Ubermenschen, bringing about the dawn of the new gods, right? They have this delusion that they're going to achieve immortality, this idea of the singularity is just around the corner. We're going to download our consciousness into computers and live forever. I mean, the first thing when anybody starts talking about that, the first thing I do is look at them as individuals. How do they live their life? Are they incredibly alienated from their own humanity, the humanity of other people, nature itself? Do they have any sense of wisdom, any sort of moral depth that sets them apart from anybody else? Or are they, just elites in a broken system that produces fucked up elites with fucked up, economic incentives coming out of these monopolies, these tech monopolies that they formed, and, sort of delusionally grandiose about what they're out to achieve. I mean, these people will literally talk about creating new gods. Ray Kurzweil, who's this sort of techno-futurist, the head of Google for a long time, he was asked this question, does God exist? And he said, not yet. And the implication being that they're building God. And who are these people? Are these people worthy of building a God? Even if that is possible, even if it's not just complete delusion.
Right.
And so the people and the incentive structures and the corporations that are behind these technologies need to be, I think, the main locus of our skepticism, because these are not particularly wise people. These are not particularly deep people. Look at Mark Zuckerberg, look at Elon Musk, and look at other people that you see in this space. Are these the sort of people that are really worthy of even aspiring to the goals that they claim to aspire to? Or are these, in a sense, really sort of small, delusional people, scared of their own death, perhaps, very short-sighted, blinded by their own delusions, creating technologies that they are promising will just radically change for the better all of the society, but coming from where they come, we should and we can be very skeptical of that. So, yeah, do you have any thoughts on that part of it?
Yeah, so the techno-cult side of things is fascinating because this goes back actually much further back than like the current wave of LLMs and OpenAI and kind of where we're at the moment. So on the internet, this idea of sort of a techno-utopian but also techno-dystopian development of artificial general intelligence has been around for a long time. Futurism has predicted the possibility of this for quite some time, and you've had individual people within tech who have basically claimed that the development of AGI is an inevitability, right? That is actually kind of one of the central claims in this ideology, is that eventually technology will achieve a certain level of complexity where AGI becomes inevitable. And then the question that humanity is posed with is, what kind of being is that AGI going to be, right? Which, if AGI is really inevitable, is a fair question, I think. Like, that is something that we should wrestle with. Is it going to be a deeply misanthropic being? Will it be a benevolent being? Those questions matter. But it is kind of taken for granted that it is going to develop. And within tech, you have various people who have basically self-appointed themselves as, I'm going to be the person who funds the development of AGI to make sure that it's benevolent, right? That is really this idea. So a lot of these discussions go back originally to an online forum called Less Wrong, where this idea of affective altruism really began to develop. You get these tech people who become very focused on the idea of, we need to guide the development of AI to make sure that it is not evil. If any of you, I won't get into the details of it, have ever heard of Rogo's basilisk as a thought experiment, that goes back to Less Wrong. It is specifically a thought experiment about the risk of making AGI that is evil and is not benevolent. So these concerns go back a long way. And basically, you have a number of people in tech who have said that, yeah, they're going to put their money into this to make sure that AGI, when it develops, will not destroy humanity. And I think, as you pointed out, Brett, there's a good question where we might ask, does someone like Elon Musk, for example, have a good understanding of what benevolence means? It strikes me that the answer is no. Right. But a number of the people who put themselves in this position, have politics that I think are increasingly blatantly fascist. Like, I think it is not a stretch to say Elon Musk's politics are pretty straightforwardly fascist at this point, straightforwardly anti-Semitic as well. And, those people claiming that they're developing AGI in a humane direction obviously have politics that push against that. And in addition to that, the development of AGI under their model is still under private control, right? It is still going to be backed by investors who can push projects in directions they want. It is still going to be done largely through private research with a profit incentive. And I think, given that, we might also ask, is a profit incentive compatible with humanistic benevolence, right? And so I think, individuals aside, the very structure under which the idea for this research to occur is happening is at odds with the stated goal of creating benevolent AGI eventually. So you do have this kind of, it is sort of techno-utopianism. Utopianism maybe oversells it, though, because they're driven by this weird apocalypticism, right? This weird fear of an inevitable AGI that will destroy humanity, and wanting to respond and steer us against that. This is why you get people like Elon who always make statements about AI being the greatest threat to humanity, right? There is a weird dystopianism and apocalypticism to it, where they then kind of get to be the savior figure who saves us from that by making sure the thing that emerges is a nice techno god for us or something like that. So there's a very strange ideology at play there. There's a very religious ideology at play there. And there's the development of this technology in ways that I think, even if AGI is inevitable, and even if they claim to want to be making it benevolent, they're probably just making a capitalist fascist AGI, right? Absolutely. Which certainly doesn't seem any better to me.
Yeah, like sort of, selling themselves as the saviors when they're incredibly limited people, morally, spiritually, existentially, imaginatively, but they live in this sort of this feverish echo chamber where they are all sort of reinforce each other's ideas and their own superiority, and they really do sort of buy their own bullshit. And that's incredibly dangerous, and that's one of the problems of a complete lack of democracy is these technologies come online with absolutely no input from regular people. And the people that the figures that are cultivated in this space, the people that rise to these levels have been through the ideological washing machine, as it were. They're the elites of a system. A certain sort of system has produced them, and those premises, the premises of that system, far from being questioned, it produced them. So it must be right. It must be good in its own right. And so there's a complete lack of skepticism of their own ideology. There's a complete lack of humility. And these people are ego monsters. And just from the perspective of people completely dominated by delusion and greed and their own egos, whatever they produce is going to be marred with those traits, those attributes of the people that create them. And not just the people individually, the ideology that creates them, and also the corporate and material basis out of which they spring, which is something that, makes me have a lot of pause. Now, is this stuff inevitable? I think there is a certain sort of inevitability that we can disagree about the timeline. We can disagree about whether it ever reaches sentience, consciousness. We'll get into that in a second. But it does seem to be like that there's a certain inevitability, that there's no restraints, there's no checks and balances stopping any of this. One company makes a breakthrough, nobody's going to stop them. In fact, there's an arms race. It's just like with nuclear proliferation. No democratic oversight. Nobody casted a vote for let's create nuclear weapons. These small elites and like the Manhattan Project and this almost conspiratorial, scheming and plotting outside the mechanisms of democracy and mass input create this horrific weapon that now haunts all of us. It could literally end the world. It dropped 2 on Japan, slaughtering hundreds of thousands of innocent people, incinerating them, burning their shadows into the concrete with no input from regular people. Now we just have to live with this shit. To make that exact same mistake in the 21st century with a brand new, possibly very dangerous thing, I just think is like, how many times can we luck out? Like, the mere fact that we haven't blown up the world 7 times over with nuclear weapons seems like an achievement in its own right. And it's like, let's keep creating stuff, never questioning the premises, never looking inward, never asking who are the people and the ideologies creating it, because keep doing it. And it has a momentum in its own right, and that's incredibly dangerous. So that's something to think about. And then, lately, especially as of very late, we've seen a real increase in investment. And when you see an increasement of capital investment into a new technology, that exasperates and accelerates the development of that technology. And so people are now talking about a hard takeoff for AI, or the time span being months to a couple years. Some people have pointed out 2029 as the time when artificial general intelligence emerges. Now these are all just guesses, of course, but whether it happens tomorrow, in 5 years, in 10 years, in 15 years, we should be thinking deeply about the implications. We should be struggling for democratic input into these decisions that are going to affect all of us, our children, our grandchildren, the entire future trajectory of humanity. These are certainly things that we should have a say in, be educated on, etc. But the very idea that peasants like Alyson and I and you, dear listener, should have any input to the Silicon Valley elite is laughable. We are not intellectually capable of understanding the heights that they have reached and the depth of thinking that they have done on these subjects. So there's a sort of disdain for the very idea of democracy. And of course, Elon Musk, I think, personifies that in like a really singular way. But that is a widespread belief in that entire community, I think. Yes, absolutely. Now, do you have anything to say to that, or do you want to move into like these questions of capitalism?
Well, so I'm interested in talking about the question of inevitability a little bit, whether or not it is actually inevitable, because that's where, I think I'm a bit of a skeptic on some of these questions slightly. So, if we could go down that path real quick, I do have a couple thoughts on.
Please.
Yeah, so I am at least highly skeptical of any claim that says we can put a concrete date on AGI, right? Definitely 2029 seems way too soon to me. Maybe I will eat my words on that one and the world will end. But generally, I think that seems way too soon. And I think part of the issue, right, is that I think LLMs, which again are the existing dominant form of AI that most people are interacting with, it's the form of AI that looks like thought, right? Because you can kind of converse with an LLM, and that kind of grants that idea of thought there a little bit. But I think LLMs are like very far from AGI in a way that people don't want to wrestle with, and it's not even clear to me that if AGI develops, it will develop out of LLMs. So I think for me, there's kind of some room for skepticism around this. So there's this question, I think, of like, does our current AI like pose a risk of developing generalized intelligence? And I think I lean towards the skeptical side for a few reasons that then I think have political implications. So one, I think there's like an epistemological issue with this question, which is that I think humans don't know what intelligence and consciousness are, right? We have a lot of different theories about it, and this is actually interestingly where science and philosophy begin to overlap with theory of mind and neuroscience, but there's not anything near a conclusion in either of those two fields about what consciousness is, what makes consciousness arise, and the relationship between consciousness and intelligence, i.e. can things be conscious but lack generalized intelligence? It would seem to be the case. So there's all of these issues. And then the other issue that I think is like a huge epistemological constraint that I think matters is sort of a familiarity bias in an anthropocentric frame. We as humans do thought through the type of consciousness that humans have, right? And so we have this sort of predisposition to assume that consciousness will look something like our consciousness, which may be a total bias, right? It may be very, very possible that if consciousness were to emerge in some sort of synthetic system, it wouldn't look anything like human consciousness. So I think there's these epistemological issues as well. And then I think broadly, one of the big issues that I have with this idea is that a lot of the AGI kind of inevitability claims are based on what I would call emergent theories of consciousness. So one approach to consciousness, and there are people within neuroscience and philosophy of mind who would support this, basically say that consciousness is just an emergent quality of sufficient complexity within the material reality of the brain, right? So the brain reaches a certain level of electrical activity, and consciousness emerges as a byproduct of that. We don't understand the causal relationship, but it's an emergent property. And most AI development is basically built on this theory, right? That if we get sufficiently complex hardware, eventually these things that we see now, which are not consciousness, might become consciousness. And that could be totally wrong, right? Like that actually just might be the incorrect theory of consciousness. And if it turns out to be incorrect, then all of the AI development that's happening right now is developing in the wrong direction, right? It could actually be developing away from consciousness. So there's a very real possibility that the type of development we're doing is wrong because our understanding of what consciousness is wrong. And then the last thing that I think, gives me pause is I just think there's a huge gap between what LLMs are and what consciousness might be and what knowledge formulation might require. Because LLMs are able to take training data and synthesize from within that training data, but they can't take anything external to that data and synthesize with that information. And for me, maybe I'm just too impacted by Hume on this particular front, but I think if you can't synthesize experience with information that you already have, you're not capable of making inference, which is a necessary process for developing knowledge, right? And for especially developing forward-facing knowledge. And so until that gap is bridged, which is not quite in place for LLMs, I don't even really know if we can say that these models have anything close to knowledge in the proper epistemological sense. So we may get AGI, we may be developing in the right direction, those bridges may be crossed, we may close those gaps, but I think there are much bigger gaps than people want to give credit for. So I'm more skeptical of these imminent inevitability claims. Inevitability may still be the case. I just don't know how imminent it is, because I think there are big philosophical questions here. And I think this is where you see that techno-utopianism wanting to bridge over these questions, right? And there's this capitalist ideology at play of, well, the science actually doesn't matter. If I just throw billions at this, we'll obviously get it, right? And that might not actually be true.
Right. Yeah, that's really interesting to get into the question of consciousness, because we know that there can be consciousness without intelligence or self-awareness. We have animals all along the spectrum that I would assume are conscious on some level, but are very limited in what they're able to conceptualize or conceive. They don't have necessarily self-awareness. They're programmed by evolution to fill a niche, and their sort of instincts are geared in that direction. So there's consciousness without what we would consider intelligence. Can there be intelligence without consciousness?
Yeah.
Can we create machines that are more intelligent than us, whatever that means, right? And as a side note, intelligence is not just the IQ, right? There's many forms of intelligence. There is social intelligence, there's emotional intelligence, there's creative intelligence, there's mathematical intelligence. Maybe some things like mathematical intelligence, we could create hyper-intelligent machines that can do that. For other stuff, maybe not so much. Certainly emotional and social intelligence is important and informs other forms of intelligences, but to have a hyper-intelligence that is really good at mathematical and logical intelligence, but has almost nothing in the realm of emotional and social intelligence, I think creates a concern of its own, a possible pitfall of its own. And that's to say nothing of the imminence, right? Setting that question aside, because I do agree with that basic point. It's probably, and if I had to bet money, probably not as imminent as many of these people are portraying it to be. But there's this, in philosophy of mind, there's this very famous article by Thomas Nagel called "What's It Like to Be a Bat?"
Yeah.
And whenever we talk about consciousness and intelligence, I do think about that a lot. Because, if we have this presupposition that we're creating at least a possibly conscious entity, as you were saying, Alyson, that consciousness could be incredibly different in ways that matter than anything that we would sort of want to call conscience or think about when we say the word consciousness. So that's certainly interesting. Now, sort of stepping back even further and looking at like a really speculative, philosophical, universalist perspective,
right?
You sometimes think about the evolution of consciousness. And, not to be like a Hegelian idealist about it, but, there is this sense in which, whether it's primary or secondary, epiphenomenal, whatever the truth is about consciousness, there's this sense that evolution has pushed forward an evolution of consciousness. You start with very simple creatures, entities, single-cell organisms, and through the processes of evolution via natural selection, higher and higher capacities continue to form. And certainly human consciousness is an intelligent, self-aware consciousness that we can say sort of, more or less objectively is a higher level of consciousness than a cockroach or a cat or a dog or whatever other animal you might want to point at. So insofar as that's true, then we ask the question, okay, the universe is very big. There are almost certainly other entities and sentient creatures out there on the cosmos. There are almost certainly life that evolution has been able to act upon. And there could be aliens out there that got, a billion-year head start or whatever it may be,
right?
That have a much higher level of consciousness than we do. And then it's at that point, it's sort of like trying to imagine the fourth or the fifth, sixth, seventh dimension. It reaches the ceiling of our conceptual ability to try to conceive of what it would mean for consciousness to be significantly more evolved than the human consciousness.
Yeah.
And that's a very interesting thing. But I always am reminded of this Nietzsche quote that I always think is very interesting and always gives me pause. He makes this point many times throughout his work, but in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he says, Man is something that shall be overcome. Man is a rope tied between beast and overman, a rope over an abyss. What is great in man is that he is a bridge and not an end. And there's this idea, which, evolution says this is true. Just logical, philosophical speculation says this is true, that evolution, cultural, biological, technological, has not stopped. We're not the end point of some process. We are, by definition, transitional. And that means something comes beyond us. Just as, Neanderthals and earlier forms of hominids were sort of transitionary creatures to us. And so then we ask, does that take the form of biological evolution? Well, that seems really slow and weird. It seems like we're able to fly from the nest of mere biological, evolution via natural selection. Now we're able, especially with the dawning of gene editing, the deep understanding of biology, our cultural understanding, that we're able to sort of do cultural and technological evolution and sort of, kind of take the reins in the coming years, if we wanted to, of our own evolution. And, some people have speculated that the creation of artificial general intelligence or artificial superintelligence far down the line, maybe we're a transitional creature for that. And maybe that is a higher level of consciousness. But then there's also something incredibly scary about the idea that I was alluding to earlier, where it's intelligent but not conscious. And then we hand over the reins and we're actually not advancing consciousness. We're not evolving it. We're ending it.
Right.
And then you have these philosophical zombies in the form of machines that might go on to colonize an entire galaxy over millions of years, but that don't have a light on the inside. And that's sort of a deep cosmic horror that at least gives me pause, although it is highly speculative, of course. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so broadly, I think you brought up a couple things that I think are interesting that will help frame how I see that last potential question. So the Nagel article is interesting, right? This famous, what is it like to be a bat? The answer to a certain degree is you can't know, which I think is an important answer, because when I was getting at that anthropological bias or anthropocentric bias, what Nagel suggests that I think is the most important thing here is that it's not even quite a bias. It's fundamentally built into trying to do a theory of mind, right? We can only do that within our own mind, right? There's a fundamental inability to access what another mind might be like and what it might be like phenomenologically to experience being the kind of being that has that mind. So that it leads to my skepticism in a lot of ways, right? I think even if we can recognize our anthropocentric bias, Nagel suggests a hard cognitive limit, right, on our ability to ever get beyond that bias in a way that I think, is important here. And I think when you bring in evolution, this is where it's interesting to me, right? Because I think the AI utopianism can accidentally take a very linear theory of evolution, right? Which says that humanity has the highest level of evolved consciousness and intelligence, which maybe, again, there's so much definitional vagueness there that who knows. And so the next step is going to be a thing that we then create that will replace us. But that is still so anthropocentric. That still puts us so thoroughly in the driver's seat of evolution in a way that I think is ahistorical given the grand scheme of the universe in its history and how short of a time we have existed. And also the reality that there are other creatures on Earth who have a good claim to a high level of potential generalized intelligence that looks radically different from humans. So the example that I think of that is always the most fascinating to me is cephalopods, right? So increasingly, as we do more research on cephalopods, we are finding that they have a level of intelligence that is actually very comparable to some of the most advanced animals, probably on par with, or perhaps beyond cetaceans, which are whales, dolphins, which are generally known for their intelligence. And cephalopods seem to have something that may represent consciousness. But here's where it gets really weird, is that the underlying hardware of cephalopods is remarkably different from ours, right? So one of the strange things about them is they essentially have a small brain for each of their legs, which is a really fascinating thing. So they do have some sort of central nervous system, but they also have these localized nervous systems that are able to make their individual body parts operate somewhat independently from each other, but not on pure instinct. There seems to be something like thought involved in it. And so here's this really interesting thing where here's this animal that has problem-solving capabilities that, to the degree that we can measure them, seem to compare to human children, and who has an underlying neurology that is very alien by, compared to the human mind, and evolved in a completely different context. And so if we look at the cephalopod and we think of cephalopods as having the potential for something like consciousness, I think what that shows is that evolution can evolve consciousness that looks very different than human consciousness on hardware that looks very different than human hardware, right? And that perhaps might be a point in favor of the possibility of AGI in a synthetic system running on synthetic hardware. But it also points to the fact that this idea that humans are this linear evolution towards consciousness is kind of a mistake, right? That evolution has occurred in other places in radically different forms. And so I often think we kind of really, in the techno-utopianism, overplay our position as the intelligent species on the planet, and is obviously what consciousness needs to look like, and are again developing attempts at AGI based on those anthropocentric assumptions that might be a mistake. Now, in a sense, though, this raises the possibility that you got at, which is a scary possibility, which is that maybe if AGI exists, it looks nothing like human consciousness, right? Maybe there's something that will get created eventually, which is totally alien to how the human mind works, but is still a consciousness or an intelligence, one without the other potentially, that can supersede us. That seems totally possible to me, but we don't know how we would ever get there, again, because of those hard constraints in our own consciousness that Nagel imposes. How would we ever know how to build that kind of system? Right? So for me, there's both skepticism and, possibility within these ideas, but I think there is this just like underlying anthropocentrism to so much of the AI talk and underlying linear kind of destiny-based evolutionary thinking that I think is overly confident for a species which has been around for an iota within the grand scheme of the universe.
Absolutely. Well said. And a product of underlying sort of political and social ideology.
Right.
This very pragmatic, liberal capitalist sort of approach to the world, linear progress, etc. It is a sort of cult of progress, if you will, that sort of gives rise to those delusions. But I really love your point about other forms of intelligence, other forms of sort of hardware, and that human beings and our form of intelligence and consciousness is a branch of the evolutionary tree, not the peak of the evolutionary mountain. And thinking about it in those lines is very interesting. And to add to your point, I often think, and this sort of goes back to what it's like to be a bat, but is how and Hume, right? How sensory apparatuses dictate how we orient ourselves and understand the world, and probably shapes our consciousness. So one of the things that Nagel brings up in that essay is like echolocation. We are so visually oriented creatures that it's incredibly difficult for us to try to put ourselves just sensorily into a world of echolocation and then to draw conclusions about what that would mean about our own self-awareness, how we'd understand the world. If a species with echolocation or different sensory apparatuses got to the point of developing philosophy and science, would it go in radically different directions or have a radically different style? That's interesting. Humans, we have 5 senses. Some of us have a 6th sense where we can see Bruce Willis, but most of us just have 5 senses. The 6th sense, people talk about proprioception, like where your body is in space, well, whatever, 5, 6, whatever. I often think like aliens across the universe, like evolution shaped them in such a way that not only do they might have a different nervous system, different hardware with relations to like the brain or whatever that might look like, but what would a being with 12 sensory apparatuses? How would they conceive the world? How would their consciousness evolve? How would they, think, even just thinking about their world, their basic premises they take for granted? And so that is, if highly speculative, at least humbling in our sort of understanding of intelligence, etc. Which that is precisely what is lacking with these people and these techno-utopians in this. Like we've been calling it a techno-cult, because it does have deeply religious undertones. It's messianic. It is like we're bringing on the, like Christians would talk about Jesus coming back. Like we are giving rise to new gods. This idea that, which is the ultimate form of not being humbled, is this idea that you can live forever. That we're just going to figure, like, we don't even know what consciousness is, but we're going to figure out how to download it into fucking computers. Are you insane? And then these people that are Ray Kurzweil is one of them, actively trying to keep their bodies alive so they can get to the point where we have the singularity where their consciousness can get downloaded. Now, this is, again, highly speculative, philosophical rambling, if you will. But another thing I think about is immortality. Like, we don't know what the point of life is. We have this sort of secular, atheistic, scientific view that is sort of the mainstream, and a lot of these people would more or less adhere to certain versions of that. But that's just our current iteration of how we think the world is. And a lot of people deeply believe it to just be unquestionably true, but go back to medieval Europe and ask people if Jesus and God exist, and there wouldn't even be a question. There's not debates, and there's not debates over whether God exists or not. You talk like that, you're going to get burnt at the stake. Like everybody in the community, we know for a fact. And you go back to any sort of religious belief, animism, Greek and Roman gods, anything. These things were fully believed, like the modern subject of modernity and postmodernity. Maybe not postmodernity, of modernity, fully believe in science as the truth-finding mechanism. And So first of all, that's incredibly limited. You should be skeptical of that because we've only been around for a short period of time. We've always taken what we assume to be true as totally true, and those things have been overturned with enough time. Everything we find out about the universe turns over some other premise that we had, previously about the nature of the universe or biology or whatever it may be. So there's a complete lack of humility there. But so with all of that in mind, even if you could, which I do not believe you can, especially not on any timeline that I can fucking see,
right,
be immortal. Like what if there are other things that happen when you die? What if you were meant to go through this as a process and be liberated to something else? Or there could be a million things. The fact that the universe exists at all is so fucking insane that almost anything could technically be true. And we don't fucking have any way of knowing what is true, what is beyond the cosmos, what came before it, what might come after it, even how the universe is going to end. And we're talking about downloading our consciousness into computers forever. I mean, that just seems like incredibly scary and evil. And there's this idea of like being trapped in a digital universe of our own shitty simulation and never being liberated by death. Like, do you know how cursed immortality would be? How fucking horrifying it would be to never be able to fucking stop this shit. I will take an atheistic death to immortality in this cosmos any day of the motherfucking week. And that's just something that these people just blast right past. Yep, I'm going to download my consciousness and live forever. Okay, psycho. No, thank you,
Yeah, no, and that's the thing, is even if death is we close our eyes and that's it, right? And it is just the complete obliteration of the self. I think that's fine, right? I'm going to go ahead and throw that out there. One of the things, this has been a really fascinating thing in my personal life. My grandparents are in like their late 80s now. And a really fascinating thing talking to them is, and I find this very beautiful, actually, they are so unafraid of dying. Yes. Both of them kind of know it's probably around the corner, right? Like it is going to come for them. And they are just not bothered by it in this way that I find has this profound dignity to it. Honestly, there's like something beautifully human about it in both of them, where even one of them is like, when it happens, it happens. Honestly, I'm tired, right? Yes. And I think like, I don't know, there's something so beautiful in that ability to say, like, I've lived my life, right? I have had my life, and it doesn't have to go on forever, and it's okay, and I don't have to be afraid, even if there's nothing after this, right? And I just think, wow, that is... what a thing to rob humanity of, right? What a dignity to steal from people if you're going to upload us into the cloud forever, right? And I think the hubris of it compared to the humility of a human being able to face our own finiteness just drives me insane on a certain level, honestly. Like, I just can't understand that level of hubris. I can't understand that disdain for life, because death is a part of life, right? And it really is, in this own way. I think they see themselves as very Nietzschean, but they really do have their own kind of life denial and hatred of life in the same way that Christianity does in the Nietzschean framework. They have their own goal for escape. They have their own idea that the engagement with the present is ultimately irrelevant except for the investment in the escape into the afterlife. It's just the afterlife is some technological afterlife, right? And there's such a sickening disdain and nihilism at the core of it, honestly, that I just, it really invokes a sort of revulsion in me. Then again, I look at just simple people like my grandparents able to just face the reality of this is probably coming to the end, and I'll choose that every day, over this fucking weird nihilistic life hatred.
Absolutely. And you're absolutely right to put your finger on the nihilism of it, the disdain for life, the inseparability of life and death, and this just complete revolt against nature, trying to literally replace nature with technology. And the hubris that requires to even think in that direction. And then the world that they want to build is not I'll revolt against that world all day. And the important thing to remember is Nietzsche wasn't even Nietzschean, right? He was this incredibly like fragile, sort of bitter incel in some ways, tended to for his entire life, especially the second half of his life, by women who were like literally keeping him alive, ultimately his sister, but other women as well, tending to him throughout his entire life. And of course, his philosophy of Übermensch and self-control and the transcendence of all values and this powerful being who's not restrained by the herd is a sort of psychological projection from his inner weakness and his inner inability to be that. And so, it's we got to psychologize Nietzsche before we take on his ideas. And these people don't fucking do that. And of course, the Nietzschean elite, the herd and then the elite. I mean, a lot of people, especially in Silicon Valley, sort of think of themselves as this new aristocracy or this Nietzschean Overmensch, this Übermenschen. The elite have almost never been this romanticized view that these people have for them. Like the old aristocracy, they had this idea of like tenderness toward the common people, and they ruled with dignity, and this sort of Marcus Aurelius idea of this elite that were truly deserving and were compassionate and wise in their rule. Complete and utter bullshit. It's never been the case. Sure, there might have been in the full spectrum of emperors and kings and aristocracies a couple people who were a little bit more thoughtful than the others, but for the most part, they're just regular fucking people, in some ways less morally developed. I said on a recent Patreon episode that like talking to just like kind of like what you were saying with your grandpa, just talking to like regular working class people, like people in their 40s and 50s, there's sometimes more virtue, more moral clarity, more wisdom in regular common people who actually had to live a real life than these elites who are sort of floating in this ethereal upper realm of class society where they're completely cocooned within their echo chambers and complete comfort and opulence. They have drivers and a servant class who serve them. That's not the conditions in which wisdom and moral depth can even grow. And so, this nostalgic idea for a true elite, this Nietzschean is complete bullshit. And of course, these people buy into it because it's a nice story for your ego to tell. I'm not just a fucking neoliberal subject who, through complete luck and chance, happened to end up in this Silicon Valley fucking job creating an app that does the same thing as 100 other apps. I'm actually a Nietzschean Übermensch who's transcended good and evil. Shut the fuck up. But to your point about old people accepting death, so important. When I was at an undergrad, I took a gerontology class, gerontology, where it's like sort of a focus of end of life care, etc. And one of the projects was go to a nursing home and interview, old people and about their life, etc. So I remember I went out there by myself. I went to a nursing home. I was allowed in, and some people volunteered to be interviewed, and every single person, they were in their fucking 90s, and I had to ask them, "Are you scared to die?" Not a single person hesitated to say, "Absolutely not." A lot of them did refer to religious faith, but my grandparents right now, who I'm incredibly close to, who raised me for huge chunks of my childhood, who I love dearly, they're in their late 70s. They're atheists. They got in a car crash in their late 20s, and they lost a daughter. She was 5 years old. My mom was in that crash as a 7-year-old, almost died, but was saved barely. But her sister passed away, and all the trauma that came with it. It was in the 70s. There's no mental health care. Your family doesn't know how to deal with trauma. Like, you just left to your own devices. And that really just changed their worldviews, These simple rural Iowa folk who, had tragedy upon tragedy and then sort of lost any belief in God. And they're approaching, their 80s. And, my grandma has lung cancer, and, my grandpa has these issues. And they try to stay as healthy as they can and as vigorous as they can. But I have these open discussions with them. As atheists even, are you scared to die? And there's not an ounce of hesitation. And they both say the same thing. Absolutely, I'm ready. Like, when my time comes, I'm ready. And to be in that psychological space, as a 35-year-old, I sort of sometimes will get into counting. I'm like, okay, 35 plus 35 is 70. So I've lived maybe half my life, maybe a little under half my life. When I hit 40, okay, then am I really like on my halfway point? And that's sort of like, counting down the day. But like, imagine your reasonable time span being 2 to 5 years. And having to grapple with that. But there's something about the aging process where that fear becomes less and less, and you are tired, and your bones do want to rest. Right. And for a 25 or a 35-year-old to think about annihilation is unfathomable. What are you talking about? I can't conceive even being okay with that idea. But then ask that same person when they're 75, 80 years old how they feel. Now, there are exceptions, and I actually have somebody, a family friend who I don't know personally, but I'm close with the person who's close with them. And they just passed away 2 days ago at 65 years old. And it reminds me of the Leo Tolstoy novel, The Death of Ivan Ilyich, was absolutely terrorized at the point of death, to the point where they had to heavily sedate him just to prevent the panic attacks. When he would start screaming, "I don't want to die," and pulling out tubes and stuff and trying to just panic and get the fuck out of there. And I think that is a product of never wrestling with that question throughout your life.
Yeah.
You need, there in the wisdom traditions, in the mystic traditions, in Buddhism, in philosophy, again and again across cultures, there's this idea of you need to learn how to die before you die. Wrestle with your own mortality. Buddhist or Christian mystics would have like a skull on the corner of their desk to remind them every day that death is happening. There's forms of meditation in Southeast Asia where you literally sit around and meditate around a rotting corpse and watch the process of decay to become intimately familiar with the realities of death. And I think the Ivan Ilyich of the world and the terrorized people at the end of death are precisely those people who don't know themselves, who have never wrestled with these questions, who've always tried to put them off. And I feel like this Silicon Valley Techno-Cult idea of immortality is precisely that. And far from being wise, that's anti-wisdom. That's a hysteria. That's a trembling, fearing ego that doesn't want to be annihilated. And of course, the ego doesn't. The more you identify with the ego, the stronger you make the ego, the locus of your entire existence, the more terrorizing death is. And so, of course, these people want to download their consciousness and live forever. They don't know themselves. They don't know death. They haven't wrestled with this shit, and it fucking terrifies them. And instead of just, accepting that and trying to deal with that, they want to run from it. They want to create these fantasies of escape from death. And that's only going to make their deaths much more terrorizing and panic-inducing than they need to be, because they will all die. Not a single one of them will download their consciousness into the cloud and live forever. And the longer it takes them to come face-to-face with that truth, the more they're going to try to shove this shit down our throats.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's the important thing, is that I think even if, AGI, all this other shit is inevitable or whatever, the idea of downloading a consciousness, I think, is impossible, right? There's not any fucking actual basis to think that's a thing that can be done. Again, because we don't even know what consciousness is. So that is a huge problem. But even if, the emergentist kind of approach to consciousness is true, that it's just kind of this, secondary result of electrical activity in the brain, that doesn't mean that it's data, right? That doesn't mean it's the kind of thing that can be captured and stored on a drive somewhere. So it really is a self-delusion, I think, ultimately, at the end of the day as well. And it's a tragic one, because there's something meaningful to facing what it means to be human, right? That is I often think in our lives, most of us don't live very exciting or heroic lives. We work, we do what we have to do, we try to take care of our families, but the one heroic thing everyone gets to do is gets to wrestle with what it means to be human, in a sense, which is a big thing, and people have been doing it for the whole history of our species, basically. And they just are robbing themselves of that, and it really is a tragic thing.
Yeah, after this recent family friend had this panic before death, and he eventually passed away, it generated conversation with me and my daughter and my wife and stuff. And I made it very clear, and I've made it very clear for years, I want to die with my eyes wide open. I don't want to be sedated. I don't want to go in my sleep. I don't want somebody to sneak up and put a bolt in the back of my head. I want to ideally, give me fucking, I don't know, this is kind of crude, but give me fucking cancer or something where I have a timeline where I can see death coming. I can fucking wrestle with it. I want to be as cognizant and as coherent as I possibly can in that transition into death, whatever comes next, even if it is nothing but darkness forever. It's a nice sleep. I could use some sleep. But if I go to sleep and I wake up to a bright light or whatever the fuck happens, I want to be as conscious of that as possible, and I want to be the sort of person that can gently surrender, that can truly accept that death, be conscious for it, not be terrorized by it, and to give into it, to fully let go. And in Buddhist meditation in particular, that idea of letting go, that idea of disidentification, that idea of going down to the sensations of the body and getting away from conceptual abstractions is, I think, one of the best ways that you can prepare your mind, body, and soul for death. And that's why I find that practice in particular to be so useful in my life. But there's other ways to do it as well, other mystical traditions and even philosophical traditions where you can kind of wrestle with that stuff and take it head on. And I think it's really, really worth doing. And I would urge people to do it. I've been terrorized by death. I've had panic attacks over the mere mention of it. I've had prolonged, months-long existential crises where I was compulsively, day in, day out, from the moment I woke up to the moment I went to sleep, terrorized by death. And it was precisely through that process of, as I always say, having my face shoved in the shit of my own mortality, that I was able to develop a deeper and wiser relationship to death and a more compassionate orientation to all human beings because of the universal experience of being aware of our own death and having to die. And that is connective tissue to every other sentient being who is self-aware and knows that they're going to die. That's what we have in common, and that can bring us together. And so you can't have life easy. Too much comfort, is bad for you. You have to be uncomfortable. You have to face the terrors of life if you want to be a courageous person that is leveled up by the tragedies of life and not made small by the tragedies of life. And so that's something we should all keep in mind regardless of this discussion,
Yeah.
Okay. Well, let's talk a little bit about capitalism because some words come to mind. The forces of production, automation, the contradictions of social production and individual appropriation, which we've talked about many times, the idea of a basic income. We don't have to speculate about a hard takeoff or whether it's general intelligence. What we do know, what we've already achieved, is that artificial intelligence in one way or another, even if it's much more limited than a lot of these people think, is still already radically altering our society and is only going to continue to do that. And there is a real question of, it's not just very specific jobs at the bottom of the economic class ladder that are going to get automated. There's, like you were talking about medical diagnosis, talking about lawyer work, white collar jobs being completely automated very quickly, even without the rise of artificial general intelligence. And that's already sort of putting some pressure on economies and people's thoughts about the near future. But I do think that process is going to continue. And that is going to there's already these deep contradictions within capitalism, and this seems to exasperate it. But there are multiple trajectories that we could take. And from where we are right now, one of the more dystopian versions that this stuff can take is we don't try to wrestle with the class society, the structures of class society. We inject an already highly unequal economic order with this hyper-productive, automative technologies that, under capitalism, as I've said for a long time, new technologies are not used to lessen the burden on people or secure basic necessities. You end up just competing with these technologies for jobs. And so there's a future in which automation and the technology behind it is controlled by a few monopolies. And huge mass layoffs occur. There is no more quote unquote middle class. There might not even be a working class. There needs to be a consuming class. But the stratification of society where the people that right now there's monopolies, like just in the tech sector, huge monopolies on almost every sector of American industry and American economics. You have shared monopolies or monopolies outright, trusts, cartels of various sorts. That is going to be a huge problem because you can imagine a near world in our lifetime where automation comes along, productivity soars through the roof because of the efficiency of these various technologies, but the capital and the profit generated from these technologies are continued to be siphoned upward to an elite. And you have this sort of Blade Runner-esque possible future where there is it's like sort of techno-feudalism again, where, you have this small elite, this aristocracy, this tech aristocracy that owns all the fucking technology, that owns all the automation software and hardware that are continued to be made incredibly rich. I'm talking trillionaires, while there's a broad, vast underclass of people at the bottom of society, depicted in Blade Runner as literally the ground level of society, right?
Right.
The rich people are up in the towers, and the poor people are down in the crowded, streets, neon-filled streets, and that's a very real. At least possibility. Of course, there's going to be struggle against that. And already one of the ideas is a basic income. But you could still fit a basic income very well into a highly stratified class society with elites and a sort of servant/consumer class where we might not have to go to work, and we get a basic income to be able to afford the basics of life, but that everything politically, economically, socially is still controlled by a really small elite of people. And so we think we're being liberated from jobs, but we're just being liberated to just continue to sort of get by as we're getting by month to month when our little basic income check gets not mailed to us, but downloaded into our bank account or whatever the fuck. And just all the contradictions that's going to generate, including, of course, war and empire and surveillance and the ability for that sort of techno-fascism to protect itself through domination and control of even pissed off but ultimately powerless populations. So what are some of your thoughts, especially with regards to the advancement of the forces of production, class society, etc.?
So this is where it gets interesting with AI. I'll talk about existing AI that we have right now. So again, LLMs, image models, all of these stable diffusion, all of these kind of approaches that we have right now. So what is fascinating about them is that I all think they don't do shit to advance the means of production, essentially. So the existing ones certainly are creating instability, and they are taking jobs, but they are taking very specific kinds of jobs in post-industrial societies in a way that I think is quite interesting. So I write code for a living. I'm a software engineer. I probably am slightly at risk of my job being impacted by this. I've seen the code writing AI kind of stuff that can be done. I incorporate AI when I write code daily. I use it to help me write code. Currently, as it exists, I am still a necessary part of that process because I have to look through the code generated by the AI and make sure it's correct. And I need to understand what it's doing to put it in the context of other code that already exists in the system, right? The AI can't do the entire thing, but it sure does a part of it, and it could potentially increasingly do more and more of it. Advertising has seen a big part of AI because there's a bunch of bullshit copywriting jobs, just like there's a bunch of bullshit coding jobs in our economy, right? Where people write text that only exist to exist in ads or tweets or all these other things. Those are at risk of AI. Artists are also at risk with AI because more and more projects might just use AI art. I'm a big fan of Magic the Gathering, the card game, and the big fear everyone has is that they'll start using AI to create their art instead of commissioning artists, right? That is like a very big fear. So there are currently disruptions that are happening, but they're not happening within industry, right? They're happening within these kind of post-industrial segments of society. But most tech at the end of the day is just an extension of advertising or private advertising surveillance, right? So even the tech jobs being disrupted are really a part of this broader consumer economy that is not really about commodity production per se. So I do think that we find ourselves in this interesting place where currently, at least with the existing technology, production is not really being changed. It is, again, post-industrial jobs that are being affected. Which is particularly interesting. We may see AI disrupt kind of tertiary service economies as well. The point could come where you don't necessarily need people in retail. You could have a machine with an AI who does the checkout process, right? Something like that could get disrupted, but production itself isn't really being infringed upon within AI. And I find that very interesting for a couple of reasons. One, it means that I think it does very little to progress capitalism towards something that could transcend capitalism. Actually, it's really just being used to create the consumptive part of capitalism at a higher rate, but not the actual productive or socialized parts of capitalism. And it also is why I'm very skeptical about the idea that even putting this technology under like socialist control would make it useful, because I don't think you need ads under socialism, right? In the same way. So a lot of the applications of this technology, I think, fundamentally wouldn't have a use case in a socialist world. They're so tied into capitalism, fascinatingly, actually, that makes me wonder whether or not these technologies could ever have a productive role, even if put under democratic control of the working class. So there's some weird stuff materially at play with those. So I don't know how much they'll shape things, but there is the possibility that at some point this AI will get integrated into actual production, right? Will get integrated into actually creating physical commodities, at which point I think the much larger social disruption could occur, right? That's when societies beyond just Western post-industrialized societies, but more, global South societies where industry still exists and has been outsourced to, could see massive disruptions. And that's where I think we would see something significant. We're not quite there yet. People haven't actually bridged that gap. again, most of these applications are so myopically consumption based. It is kind of tragic, actually, that we created this like really incredible technology and we're like, let's write ads with it.
Yeah, of course.
That's the primary thing we do. So, that bridge that gap may be bridged eventually. It's unclear to me, though, what that time frame would look like. But yeah, AI obviously brings up this discussion of a universal basic income as a solution. But I think you're right. A universal basic income wouldn't liberate us, right? It would, in fact, just maintain these consumptive models. It would just be now we have this base quota for what we can spend to consume rather than that being tied in some way to employment. So there's no liberation in that. And there's certainly room for the world to move in a much darker place, actually, if we do see this automation actually connect to commodity production itself, and then for the very process of commodity production not only to be owned by the ruling class, but also to exclude the working class because they're no longer necessary in it. And that would actually be a fundamental disruption of capitalism, right? Yeah. Because the core contradiction that Marx and Engels are teasing out is the socialization of labor versus private ownership. Well, now you have private ownership and private labor, right? You've actually completely eroded that. So there would be a fundamental transformation that occurs there, I think, that would necessitate some sort of reevaluation of how we oppose this new thing. But I don't think we're quite there yet, again, because I think it really all has these like very post-industrial use cases that limit how much damage it can do outside of imperial core countries.
Mm. Yeah, that's very, very interesting. Yeah, well, first, the idea of capitalism without workers is just, yeah. That seems like, I mean, how can there be a bourgeoisie without a proletariat, and what that means, and the consumptive model of capitalism carrying on beyond the productive, worker-centered form of it. I mean, those are just very fascinating things to deal with. But, you talk about the restaurants, retail, service economy in post-industrial societies. That's a huge chunk of our society. If those things do get automated, there's already this process of sort of reshoring industrial manufacturing after the pandemic and the fragility of, supply lines and all this stuff that's sort of naturally occurring for variables outside of just automation or the advancement of artificial intelligence. Is there a future in which service, like there's a re-industrialization? Where service stuff like retail, and you go to fast food, and it's just all automated, but yet you work at like kind of like an older version of like a factory still, producing things that have been reshored that used to be in the era of neoliberal globalization, spread around the global south, are now coming back. But I don't know, maybe you have a clear idea in your head about this, but I still feel like the world of production and industrial manufacturing and stuff can still be deeply, and in some ways already is being deeply impacted by these technologies of automation, etc. I don't think there's necessarily this clean line between, some of these service-oriented post-industrial, jobs and parts of the economy and these industrial ones. Can you maybe give me an example of like production being sort of separated from these other forms of the economy that are under assault by automation? Like, what exactly do you mean there?
Well, I guess in my mind, AI doesn't have much to offer to the already existing automation of literal physical production. So, for example, car manufacturing is very automated at this point, right? There is a high amount of machinery. There's even robotic integration into it. But that's not new, right? A lot of that machinery developed just with the very invention of industrialization, right? And so from the very beginning, capitalism has always had this automation of industry and this increasing incorporation of machinery. So I guess in my mind, a lot of what can be automated about production is already automated just on a pure machinery level. And it's not clear to me what an LLM adds to that. Right? Right. That's kind of the distinction that I'm making. So it's not that there's not the possibility of automation. It just seems to me that AI is not useful for that particular type of automation or for increasing that. Given that the machinery is already there and workers have basically been reduced to cogs within that existing machinery, taking products that are output by that machinery, maybe doing some level of packaging, although even most of that is automated with machinery at this point. I don't know what AI adds to that. So I guess it's not that there isn't automation within literal physical production. It is that I don't think that is particularly disrupted by these technologies we are seeing at the moment.
I see. Yeah, I would completely agree with that. A lot of my high school friends are like union steam fitters, union electricians, union insulators, and precisely what you're saying. Like those jobs seem to be even in some ways more secure than like the low level service economy jobs, or even some white collar, jobs that are more susceptible to even just large language model taking them over, customer service, retail, or even like paralegal work, stuff like that. So that's a good point. Okay, you've clarified that for me. But yes, that says nothing about what could happen in the future.
Yes,
large language models themselves aren't certainly the thing, but developments can still occur where even the people involved in that stuff continue to get whittled down further, which at any level is still going to create a lot of issues that need to be wrestled with and dealt with. All right, well, I think to go towards the end of this conversation, I kind of wanted to touch on this idea that you and I have both sort of talked about over text. Which is Neo-Luddism, sort of a Neo-Luddite movement, or like at least this urge within us in the face of precisely this form of technological progress ran by these types of fucking people out of this section of the society, a deep skepticism and a sort of like rejection of what they're trying to jam down our throat. The most salient way that's taken form for me recently is just like a sort of continued disgruntled, agitated relationship to just social media, the smartphone, being on the internet all the fucking time, and how much of my life that takes away. And I'm trying to get away from social media. I'm trying to get away from screen time. I'm trying to do more productive things socially and just existentially, in all those hours that so many of us now whittle away in the empty sort of scrolling that we do, the addictive natures, the purposefully addictive natures of these platforms, the jacking into our dopamine system, these little casinos in our pockets for dopamine hits, and how it deteriorates our relationships actually. I talk about how liking and commenting on your friend's life event has now taken the place of going over to your friend's house and celebrating with them, right? And how that even in the world of hyperconnectivity, we're lonelier than ever, we're more mentally ill than ever, we're more isolated than ever. And these are precisely the things I was talking about at the beginning of this conversation, wherein there's this utopian vision of what these technologies will do, and then the actual ways they manifest in a hyper-alienated, capitalist, stratified society.
Right.
And, I'm sort of more and more just rejecting all of this. I hate virtual reality. It repulses me at a spiritual and visceral level. And, I'm not going to be I'm not against technology as such, but I am against the way technology is advancing in these conditions, how they're oriented to just steal our fucking attention and our lives and our time on this planet, doing the silliest, most meaningless shit. And one of the ways that it really hits home for me is look how much the average person today invests in these social media apps and scrolling and just being a part of the whole sort of apparatus, and compare that to how little you get back out of it. Maybe you've made some new connections. Cool. Those are often very shallow connections. Somebody across the planet who shares your interest. That's cool. Maybe some of those, I even used you as an example in my Patreon episode. Some of those can develop into real friendships. But most of them stay at the level of just completely shallow, meaningless relationships that you don't actually need. Our social brains were sort of wired for community, face-to-face, just so much of our cognitive energy that we give towards reading people's body language and seeing where we stand in the social hierarchies of our actual community, and how that's just sort of being shallowized and obliterated with these new technologies, and just really wanting to turn away from it all. I don't want your fucking Meta headset. I don't want to fucking have a Facebook account and an Instagram account and a TikTok account. I don't want you to be mining my data and selling it for profit. I don't want any part of it. And I think a lot of us are starting to feel this way. And it kind of falls broadly under this tent of Neo-Ludditism, but that's sort of a crude term in its own right, and people mean different things by it. But what are your thoughts? What's your relationship to these technologies as somebody it's embedded in the tech world?
Yeah.
And what are your feelings around this idea of rejecting some of this shit, or at the very least drawing lines that we're not willing to cross?
Yeah, so this is what's tricky. So yeah, I work in tech. I write code for a living, so I'm part of the problem in this very concrete sense. And the worst part is I love writing code, honestly. I've never had a job that I like more. I think it's fascinating. I love learning about technology. I truly enjoy the process of producing software. I'm embedded in this in like these very concrete ways. At the same time, the applications for what software gets used with are heinous, in my opinion, in most instances, and just I really find horrifying. So for me, for a long time, I actually think I have been very opposed to anything that I saw as kind of a Luddite impulse. I've been very critical of kind of anarchist strains of anti-technology thought, which I think often, like the post-civilization or anti-civilization anarchism, can kind of become fascist in their own right. Sure. You get these anarchists who are like siding younger in these really interesting ways where I'm like, okay, I don't know. So I've always been critical of that, and I've tried to push back against that. At the same time, I am feeling an affective repulsion to a lot of what I'm seeing. I think something that drove this home for me the other day. I don't know if you've seen that Casey Neistat video where he's walking around New York with the Apple Vision Pro.
Yes, I actually have, yeah.
The cool, like, big moment that he has, like, oh my god, I can't believe I'm watching Mr. Beast while I'm waiting to get on a subway.
Kill me now, dude. Kill me now.
And I'm just like, oh, I want to fucking vomit. If this is the future, I'm not on board. You know what exactly. I mean? Like, there's just something I think increasingly that is striking me as horrific about it, and I think I try to walk a fine line. I have, I think, always been a Marxist who's maybe a little more on the Althusserian Marxism is not a normative ethical system kind of side of things. And at the same time, I feel a moral repulsion to some of these developments. And so there's tensions here that I'm trying to walk. I also think Marxism has a high opinion of technology generally, right? Yes. Marxism generally views technological advancement as a good thing. It's a question of how that technology is controlled. And so I think I try to be careful because of that. But increasingly we get to technology that I don't see how even put under proletarian control could be a good thing, right? So again, LLMs, I can't imagine what you do with those under socialism. They write ads, basically, right? Like, that is the main thing they do. They replace real knowledge with the simulacra of knowledge, right? I can't imagine a progressive use case for that. So I think I'm increasingly seeing technology develop where I struggle to kind of see, even if we change the material conditions in which technology is produced and in which it is implemented, I struggle to see how it advances humanity. And I think, when I look at something like the Apple Vision Pro, I see something that alienates the user. I see something that puts a wall between them and the rest of reality. And that scares me and it concerns me. And I think there's such a tightrope that we have to walk here, because it's so easy to then turn to valorizing this romantic notion of nature, right? True. And I think that becomes fascist really quickly if you're not careful with that in its own right, actually. I think that becomes reactionary in these really simple ways. And I think it also becomes naive, because nature is not a beautiful, pretty thing. Nature is the world of Ebola, right? It is the world of suffering and plagues and violence and carnivorism. Like, it's easy to overcorrect in that other direction. So there is really a line that we have to walk that I think we have to be careful walking. But there is technology that, I just increasingly am saying, I don't know, I think you put that under proletarian control and it's still a bad thing, right? And I think that's the new thing that I'm finding myself experiencing, that I'm trying to figure out how to navigate. And it does kind of crop up as this, like, Luddite response of, like, oh, I want to see that thing smashed, right? If we're really going back to the history of what the Luddites were. Quite literally, like, I want to see that technology destroyed. Yeah. And I think one thing that some of the anarchists have talked about with the Luddites, that, there are some anarchists and Marxists even who have tried to reframe the Luddites as not a reaction against technology, right? But as a reaction against the labor disruption of technology, right? Sure. As really, in fact, a labor response. And I think that allows us to see this in a way that maybe gets beyond some of the more potentially reactionary things. It's not that technological advancement is bad inherently. It's that technological advancement, has ramifications, and we need to deal with that on a case-by-case basis. And maybe sometimes that means saying no to certain advancements, which I think is a statement that would make Marx turn in his grave potentially, but which, is increasingly where I'm coming to. I do think there are just some things that we are being able to develop that also Marx could have never conceived of, right?
Yeah.
That are like kind of unthinkable to the frame in which he was writing that maybe we just need to say no to. And that's kind of where I'm coming to. I don't have a good systematized way of teasing all of that out yet, but it's an impulse I'm feeling much more recently.
Yeah, but my question with regards to the Marx idea is like, are they even, like, to your point, are they even advancements? Are they lateral shifts in certain things that technology allows for, but they're not actually inherently progressive or an inherent advancement over anything. And I think that speaks to your questions and conundrums regarding, even under proletarian control, what good are some of these things? And I think that's the thing that I wanted to assert is like with the drawing of the lines for ourselves is like, just don't passively, just be pushed into this stuff. Like you have your Apple Watch and you have your phone and now you have your Google glasses and now you have your VR headset and you're on every single social media app and that there's a sort of passivity there that people are just lured into. And if this stuff was good for us, if it was edifying, if the enrichment outweighed the cons, I don't think we'd see the mental health crisis specifically focused on young people who are coming up with these things already on their hip by the time they get self-awareness and before they even hit puberty. Where their entire worlds are now funneled into these machines created by corporations for profit. And I think we see the ramifications of that precisely in the low levels of community, of connectivity, of optimism, etc. And so I think those are alarm bells going off that like, hey, some of this stuff, it's not that we're against technology outright, but we're against the way it's manifesting in these conditions and how they don't solve but actually exasperate things like alienation, and estrangement, not necessarily from your own labor, but from your own life, from others.
Right.
One thing you said there, and I'm very kind of interested to kind of get down in this because this is actually mocked on the right. There's this idea that even with like physical fitness, that there's a body fascism with just trying to be healthy, and that gets taken so far that like anybody doing anything or making any part of their personality about being fit or something is like inherently fascist. I'm skeptical of that. And in the same way, I'm kind of skeptical with this idea that you gestured towards, which is like this return to nature being, you didn't say inherently fascist, but
right.
And I certainly agree it can take a fascist route, but I have this urge, that's the simultaneous urge of like turning away from some of this technology is my turning toward nature in the sense of me personally being in it. So the time that I would spend on my couch scrolling, I want to go fucking, swim in a fucking cold lake or, hike around the woods by myself or just go camping and just be under the fucking stars and to immerse myself in nature. And I don't think I'm not putting words in your mouth. You did not say this,
right.
There's nothing fascist about that. And so my question to you is, what form of return to nature with a V is fascist? And I'm kind of like, can you parse those thoughts out a little bit for me?
Yeah, so I have a couple thoughts. This is so funny. There was this Twitter thread like 6 months ago, no, more than that now, maybe a year ago, about how hiking is fascist.
God damn it.
Which I think was very stupid, but got at something interesting.
Okay.
Which is, there's two layers here. One is a historical layer, which is that I think the notion of nature as a thing we might go immerse ourselves in is very modern.
Fair.
In these kind of complicated ways, right? So I love hiking. One of my favorite things to do. I love going out and riding my bikes in the hills around here. I love getting out of the city and being surrounded by trees or hills and scrub. A lot of that in LA. Chaparral. That is one of my favorite things to do. But the idea of going out and immersing myself in that is actually a kind of idea that really would not have existed prior to industrialization and modernity, right? That division between civilization and nature in many ways is a product of the enclosure of the commons, right? In many ways. One would have existed within nature, i.e. the spaces that would be demarcated as the commons, just as a mere fact of survival for many people prior to enclosure happening. So there's this level of modernity that is inherently baked into that idea. And what's more, one of the types of hiking that I like doing is I like hiking up mountains. And sometimes that involves some like technical aspects of it, a little bit of winter mountaineering. That, prior to industrialized society creating leisure time, would have probably been seen as one of the stupidest things you could go do, right? Why would you go do that? It's kind of a fundamentally insane thing to do. It's actually, in fact, the kind of thing that develops during, again, the development of leisure time and this European kind of romanticization of nature, where we have to go conquer the Matterhorn and the Eiger, and we have to conquer the Alps, and then eventually we have to conquer the Himalayas, right? So within this modern notion of how we interact with nature, which really is a product of capitalism, there always is this kind of romantic conquest idea too that always somewhat worries me. So mostly I just think the distinction between nature and civilization carries within it a lot of ideological values that we often don't think about in a way that is very complicated. And then, to tie it to the question of fascism, is complicated in the sense that it is contradictory to itself. So within fascism, you have massively futuristic-based impulses and also traditionalist impulses, right? So Italian fascism becomes much more marked by the futurist kind of side of things. Futurism was a movement in Italy in particular, with this focus on technological development and fascism setting production free, right? Really becomes this idea. German fascism has a lot more of the traditionalism emphasis, right? And this return to a greater time with a huge focus on nature, right? In fact, something very comparable to what we would think of as scouting became very central to German culture leading up to the Nazi Party. And many of the early Nazi emanaries came from this kind of scouting movement, actually, that developed in the Weimar Republic. So there is this risk of a return to nature having this romanticism in it that, especially in the German context, becomes this kind of like anti-bourgeois, like, oh, we need to escape bourgeois domination and get back to something prior to that, something before that, which is at odds with Marxism, right? Where we don't escape bourgeois domination by going back, we escape it through full proletarianization, right?
Yeah.
I think you see this in Evola too, right? Actually, we got into this. This is how Evola is able to say, I am anti-bourgeois and I am a traditionalist, right?
Right.
So the return to nature can be bound up with all of those things. Now, does that mean we shouldn't go interact with nature? No, I mean, I love hiking. I still obviously want to engage with it. I have had profound experiences out in the forest, right? Mm-hmm. That I don't necessarily think I could have outside of it. But I always want to be critical of slipping into that thought process and that ideological framework too simply, because I think there's a ton of baggage to it that we have to actually wrestle with.
That's totally fair, and maybe the difference hinges on this idea of like a social or civilizational return to nature,
right?
And turning backwards to a romanticized period of the past versus like an individual, spiritual or existential, just especially in a hyper-modern, hyper-alienated, techno-capitalist society, a sort of escape into nature, not as a social program, not as a set of political demands, but as an individual, spiritual, and existential activity that is a rejection in some part of the hyper-technologized version of modern life. And like, yeah, of course, when I go into nature, there's no, and I'm pretty self-aware, there's no concept of conquest. It's like I want to be conquered by it. I want to melt into it, but your point is very valid of like this sort of modernity giving rise to this romanticization of nature and this need to go back into it because we have been alienated from it. And so, in the process of being alienated from it, there comes the urge to go back to it. And, it is like, so we are evolved as social beings, like to be integrated into nature. And the further we get away from it, the less holistic we individually feel, the more scattered I personally feel. And so, yeah, I think that difference of not making it into a social civilizational program, but as like a existential or personal remedy to some of the pitfalls of today. But the political program for me might come, and I'd love to get your ideas on this, because we agree that there is no going back. And I've said many times the only way out is through, which is going forward, is like to overcome alienation ultimately in a sort of reintegration of civilization and nature at a higher level, right? Overcoming this modernist dichotomy, this duality between, which is part that dichotomy is part of the psychology and ideology of modernity, which is this duality, right? Man versus woman, civilization versus nature, reason versus emotion, which of course are ultimately false dichotomies. There's dialectical relationships there. And the further we alienate ourselves from nature by trying to conquer it, the more alienated we actually become. And so the idea is that a future civilization would not try to conquer and push out nature to like this hinterlands where you can go out into nature. You have to leave the city and go out into nature.
Right.
But perhaps in a future there is civilization and nature that the lines are re-blurred, and we return to nature not in a romanticized fascist let's go back way, but in a we've went through the lessons of hard civilization and this hard separation. We realize its faults, and so we want to take the best of human civilization and social progress and marry it to the best of sort of a dialectical and communal relationship with the natural world, which is, of course, the basis for civilization in the first place. There is no separation in the final analysis, and maybe our civilization in the future can reflect that, and maybe that's how we escape this sort of fascistic turn of hyper-romanticizing the past relationship we had with nature.
Yeah, no, and I do think the transcendence of that dichotomy is ultimately something that Marxism seeks to do, right? If we want to get very foundational with Marx and Hegel, I think of the 1844 manuscripts, where actually I think Marx talks about nature a lot in those manuscripts, right? And actually talks about like the fundamental aspect of the human condition being the objectification of nature, right? Marx takes that as a starting point, very much just pulling this out of Hegel, right? Yeah. And I think there, you do kind of see even the material conditions that we talk about within Marxism, which then take the form of production, which is technological, are constrained by the natural world within which they exist, right? Nature's not fully transcendent. And I've hinted at this before, but what is climate change other than ultimately calling capitalism's bluff that nature and civilization are separate from each other, right? Mm-hmm. What is it other than the ultimate proof that, no, these two things have been in a dialectical relationship with each other all along, and oops, they affect each other, right? Yep. And now we are seeing that. So I do think Marxism ultimately, it does try to overcome that. Now, obviously, I think there are philosophers who say Marxism doesn't overcome that, because to objectify nature is still not to take nature as a thing in and of itself, right? Nature gets instrumentalized still within Marxism. It's a whole debate you can have there. There are various reads of Marxism. John Bellamy Foster, obviously, is an important thinker who tries to read Marxism in a more ecologically informed direction. So, a lot of ways that you can go with that. But ultimately, yes, it ought to bridge that gap. And I think socialist society ought to bridge that gap too, if only by recognizing that, the distinction is artificial. The systems that we're talking about exist both within civilization and nature as interrelated and interplaying with each other, and that ignoring that has massive consequences. It is kind of interesting too, right? Actually, that that one Marx quote where he kind of gestures at what communism would look like is very pastoral, right? Where you can be an artist and a fisherman and, this whole list of things. So the one vision we get does have this kind of very pastoral view of nature in it, which feels at odds with like the massive industrialization focus within Marx, right? Yeah. It is very weird for a man so in awe of socialized production to then imagine that very, very different vision of what humanity will look like. Yeah. I don't think, I don't know the clear answer, but I always just try to be ideologically careful with it, because I think it is too easy to slip into some ideological mistakes. But ultimately, you don't have to fall into it, even within, going out and interacting with nature in very, intentional ways. Yeah, conquest doesn't have to be what it's about. I like to stand on top of a mountain because I never feel smaller when I stand on top of a mountain. That's, for me, it is the profound humbling of the experience that I find valuable. But that doesn't mean that there hasn't been, these ideologies at play. And also, the last thing I will say is the conquest version of it also was still conceptualized as escaping alienation, right? That's what's kind of horrifying about it. Mountaineering in particular, I think, is this interesting history here, because I think mountaineers by and large are narcissists, but generally, like, if you hear a lot of the early mountaineers talk about what they're doing, it is like, I'm escaping the alienation of society and I'm conquering this peak, right? So I don't think it's necessarily so easy to say that those things are separate from each other. There's always been this weird colonial conquest ideology, also tied with kind of an anti-industrial spiritualism within that ideology as well.
Yeah, and I can certainly see how those ideologies are tempting to people. I can certainly see why you could even build entire movements around them.
Right.
And I do think in the destabilizing era of modernity, with hyper-technological progress and all of these things coming faster and faster, it feels like that there is, especially, one of the things I've been fascinated with recently is like going on to Gen Z YouTube and listening to them wrestle with existential issues of like, what are our futures? What do we want out of life? Listening to Gen Zers talk about their social media addiction and trying to kick it. And what you see a lot of is in this new generation, which, is very different than millennials, is this sort of exactly what we're talking about, this romanticization of traditional things. Like there are movements, they're usually right-wing coded, but not always, to want to re-engage with religion. To some of these people's highest goals in life is just to have a family. They want children. Yeah. They want to live this more simple life. And of course it is like a sort of natural reaction to, especially, at least like for you and I, we're like 90s kids. So we had this period of childhood before, everything moved onto screens, where we were physically engaging with the physical world, and we were hypersocial, and that set us up not to be immune to the lures of new technology, but to have a sort of bulwark against its full takeover of our minds and bodies and social selves. But people coming up right behind us, born after the late 90s, early 2000s, they've sort of just been integrated with it since they were old enough to think and have memories. And so I find it very interesting and also alarming in some ways that there does seem to be this, it's not traditionally conservative or even necessarily reactionary, although it certainly can tip into those shades. But it is this sort of re-romanticization of things that people have taken for granted forever, like just being able to have a fucking family. Yeah. Which seems impossible. Absolutely. Or just loving religion again. Like I want to be a Christian. I want to go sit in church and have that stability and that anchor in my life. I was thinking recently about how the movements of the boomers on both the left and right were very anti-social obligation. On the left version of it, you had like this sort of countercultural hippie 60s movement, drop out, do acid, expand your mind, but you don't owe anybody anything. And that's sort of a reaction to the conformity of the 40s and 50s, leave it to Beaver-ass America, right? But how that actually grew up was into the form of what we now see as neoliberalism. That complete lack of social obligations on the social and cultural level turned into the economic libertarianism that is the hallmark of neoliberalism. And it is this sort of complete lack of social obligations. Fuck you, go get, I want to do whatever I want. Hyper-individualism in extreme. And I see in the millennial generation, and these are generalizations, of course, but, among many millennials, there's this sort of urge to have a return to social obligation, to think about politics in terms of collectivity, in terms of building institutions, right? Taking care of people, housing, healthcare. We don't want the disintegration of social bonds. We don't want the disintegration of social obligation. We don't all want to be hyper-individualists striking poses into our fucking phone camera all day. We want something realer. And I think that there's now a Gen Z sort of reaction that's coming in the form of a romanticization of even traditional roles. And I find that incredibly interesting. And I don't exactly know what that bodes for our future, but as these cohorts with these sort of generational ideologies of age into power and the sort of boomer libertarians on the left and right and center age out of power, I think we are going to see changes. And I think that's going to come with a heavy dose of political reaction, but as well as on the counter, a heavy dose, which we're already seeing, of a collectivist, socialist approach to these problems as well. Like, no, we're not just all individuals that can do. We are embedded in society, and when we don't have social obligations, when we don't have community, we do suffer. And we want to build institutions and a society that takes care of everybody because we're all in it together. And that is sort of a contrast to the previous generation's hyper-individualism. And it's a sort of natural reaction. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think I've seen this trend that you're talking about, right? And it both concerns me and interests me in equal levels, I think. So I think broadly what I do want to throw out there for the listener is I think the complicated thing is that Breht and I don't think either you or I are opposed to tradition in the broad sense, right?
Correct.
I think we're both very impacted by tradition. Go listen to our mysticism episode, right? Like, there are traditions that we find massively valuable and have integrated into our lives. So I don't think that tradition inherently is reactionary, right? But unproblematic embrace of tradition and romanticization of tradition is a surefire path to reaction, in my opinion.
Uncritical, you mean? Uncritical?
Yeah. And I think we have to do it very carefully. So look, I'll be honest. I'm at odds with Lenin here, right? Lenin's position is atheism and was opposition to kind of like the God building project, right? Within the early Soviet Union and those who wanted to perhaps build kind of a secularized religion, right? I'll just go out there as a revisionist on this one. I think Lenin was wrong. I think actually religion plays important roles and tradition plays important roles in human society in a way that you can't just get rid of. And I think what we are seeing with, a lot of these younger people returning to religion, returning to a wide array of religions, too, is kind of a wild thing. The amount of young leftists I have seen who have embraced Islam in the last few years has been kind of shocking to see. So there's this broad return that is happening there. And I think that is indicative of the fact that, like, absent some of these things in your life, you're in a difficult spot in a highly alienated society. I recently watched an interview with an academic that I really appreciate, Dr. Justin Sledge, who he runs a YouTube channel called Esoterica. It's about mysticism and comparative religion. Huge fan of his work, and he was being asked about his experience of religion, right? And he's Jewish. He's part of the Reconstructionist movement, and he basically says, my view is religion is a technology. Right? It's a technology by which we can mark parts of our lives. It's a technology with which we can deal with death and grieving. It's a technology by which we can come together. So what is the religious thing that we should embrace? It's that technology, right? But that technology needs to be the useful parts and not the reactionary parts of it. And, again, I think Lenin and the traditional Leninist read would call this idea into account. They would say you can't just treat it as an independent technology. It's ideological, right? So that's where you would get that opposition. But I think the fact that religion has transcended in so many ways, so many different material arrangements of society indicates there's something probably more than pure ideology in it from my perspective. But I do want to acknowledge the tension with Lenin there. But to me, it does seem like there is something with religion that is a technology that is worth holding on to, but critically, right? That's really what I want to get back to. And so in the context that like Justin Sledge was talking about in that interview, and in the context of Reconstructionist Judaism, that meant like gutting parts of the teachings. In Reconstructionist Judaism, Mordecai Kaplan, who came up with it, took out the concept of chosenness from all the prayers, right? Having seen that as chauvinist, just straight up made modifications to them. And I think that kind of thoughtful rebuilding of the technology is probably the correct way to go about that. And so when I see young people embrace religion just like without doing that rebuilding part of it, it does worry me a little bit in a lot of ways. There is something within tradition and within religion that has value and meaning, and I would call myself religious, right? Like cards on the table. I think there is value there. But you can't do it unproblematically, and you can't not wrestle with the tensions between it and Marxism, I think. That's kind of what I want to stress. But there's a reason people are turning in that direction. There really is a reason. And I think just insisting on utter atheism actually means we'll lose those people. right? In a lot of ways. It actually means we won't have something to offer that they clearly need and are searching for right now. So it's complicated. It's always going to be my answer. But I think, I hope that Breht and I in some ways can model this relationship to tradition that is both critical and embracing at the same time. Because, that uncritical embrace scares me in a lot of ways.
Yeah. But I genuinely agree with everything you said there. And there's that fascinating development where people on the left seem drawn to Islam. There's a little bit of flirtation on the right with Islam because of its like sort of patriarchal and traditionalist aesthetics, especially to like a Westerner. But what I see on the political right, and I follow these things pretty carefully, I see this sort of embrace of Christianity writ large, but specifically Orthodox Christianity is having its moment. And I think there's something interesting because you have like young right-wing people who want to embrace their traditions, but have been sort of disillusioned with like their, version of it. So like Protestantism in the United States or whatever. And so going to the Orthodox Eastern Christianity seems simultaneously like a return to your roots of Christianity, but also something that doesn't come with the cultural baggage of a religious tradition that you grew up in and sort of rebelled against and know so well that you can't see it as being cool or different or new or, something like that. But yeah, I think that there's something interesting there that we should keep our eye on. And then this general idea, which, I don't want to overstate it, and some people don't like when I talk like this, but there does seem to be something like, for lack of a better word, a religious impulse within human beings. And that impulse does not go away when religion goes away. And part of the thing we're seeing with, as we were talking about, the Silicon Valley Techno-Cult, and I'm sure you could identify a bunch of other strains of this, is a sort of religious impulse without a God, a religious impulse without a religion. And that gets put into, I think, less helpful things because it's sort of obscured. It's sort of mystified. The people that are in this cult don't see themselves as religious. They don't see themselves as worshiping anything. They see themselves as logical, creators and inventors, pushing humanity forward. But at the same, they're worshiping their ego. They're worshiping technology. They're hyper alienated, and they're sort of turning that into its own set of virtues. And it's repulsive. And so I feel like insofar as there is a religious impulse, and I've said this before, it seems healthier to make that incredibly conscious by taking that impulse and funneling it into the proper direction, religion itself.
Right.
And when you don't do that, you begin to worship the self. You begin to worship consumption. You begin to worship technology. You begin to worship your own alienation. And that seems like a form of nihilism, like Nietzsche predicting this sort of various forms of nihilism that come in the wake of the death of God. I think we're seeing that, and people think in my new atheist phase, I had this sort of delusion that the future was going to be religiousess. That everybody was going to come to terms with the fact that God isn't real. This was all a fairy tale, and we're going to become much more grounded, scientifically oriented people. I don't think so anymore. I think what we're gonna see in the age of artificial intelligence and quantum computing and space travel are new forms of religion, and they're gonna run the gamut from incredibly sinister and mystified and weird and fascistic, cultish. And all the way over to like maybe new forms and deeper depths of human spirituality and conscious experience, developing and consciously cultivating some of the better virtues of human nature, including, universal love, etc. So far from thinking religion's going away, I think it's going to become more diverse. I think it's going to continue being central to human beings, and I think the people that trick themselves into thinking they have no rituals, they worship nothing, there is no God, they have no religious impulse, I think are the most susceptible to the sorts of cults and scams and nonsense that we see in our modern world. And that should make you at least take pause and think critically about these things.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And this is like, I was just commenting this to my partner the other day, right? Is like, this tragic thing is that Nietzsche's right. God is dead, right?
And we have killed him.
I think, Nietzsche's completely correct on that question. And then we just replaced him with all of the worst impulses repackaged, right?
Yeah.
It really is wild. I think the death of God as like the sociological phenomena almost is undeniable, right? Like Western society did indeed commit deicide, right? And as Nietzsche predicted, we then stood there and said, what do we do now, right? Mm-hmm. And we failed to answer that question. I think Nietzsche also fails to answer that question.
Absolutely.
But, you know, society on the whole, I think, has dropped the ball. And that's what I was saying is like, yeah, this like Silicon Valley shit is still life denial, right? It's still nihilism. It's still refusing to step up to the plate in the wake of what we've done, right? Which is really the challenge that Nietzsche poses for us, which, you know, I can only put forward what I think solutions look like, which again, I think may mean dealing with tradition and religion, but dealing with it consciously, right? Yes. Being honest about ourselves, about its limits, what it can do, and engaging with tradition critically. I think that can be an important part of it, and I sure prefer that to the techno-utopian bullshit, obviously, right? And again, I'm not going to pretend this isn't at odds with, like, orthodox Leninism. It definitely is. Sure. There are, like, real debates to be had here, and there's a whole historical debate within the Bolsheviks after the revolution around precisely these questions, actually. So we're not treading new ground, necessarily, but you know, the impulse is happening. Young people are moving in that direction, whether we like it or not. And I think that is largely in a reactionary manner. So we need to ask these questions and wrestle with them in some way because, again, an uncritical embrace of these things is kind of what the status quo is at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. And I, you know, we can disagree with orthodoxies. Like we're supposed to be thinking in our real time, and you know, there's nothing wrong with that. And the sort of person who insists that you must never deviate at all is the sort of, like Marx says, putting on the costumes of the past, fetishizing these ideas, copying, pasting. Think critically in real time. We're in a new era. We're in a new period of time. There's new issues to wrestle with. And so if you're going to disagree with orthodoxy, at least know why, understand it, have good reasons for it, engage with the thing in the first place. And I think, you know, hopefully you and I contribute to at least thinking through those things. And importantly, and the way I want to end this conversation is, you know, you can listen to this conversation. You can agree with some things. You can disagree with some things. I was sort of thinking to myself yesterday, like how we start hating each other for disagreeing on things. Yeah. Like, and I started laughing out loud, just thinking in my head, like how silly and childish it is to be like, they disagree with me about like Stalin and I fucking hate them. You know, like they're the worst person ever. Like they're suspect on every level. Their character is flawed. And I'm like, are we children or can we think critically? And, you know, when I put out something that somebody disagrees with, I think most people quietly just wrestle with those disagreements. Yeah. Why do I disagree with that? It's helping me to hear this perspective because even if I disagree with it, it's nice to be able to, you know, exchange swords and understand exactly why I disagree and hear the best articulation of something I disagree with and understand why I, you know, disagree with it or think through it, or vice versa, why you do agree with something. And that's what's very generative, and that's what I think you and I have always, that's the ethos we've tried to promote, because we don't have the delusion that we have all the answers. We don't have the delusion that the things that we believe right here, right now, are the things we're going to believe for all time. We're not dogmatists. We're not weirdos. We're just human beings, flawed and fragile, who make mistakes, thinking through these issues as best we can. And the point for the listener is to generate your own critical thought, not to agree or disagree with us as such, but to understand why you agree or disagree with us and to wrestle with some of these questions. Yes. And that's the whole point of literally everything I do. And that's the whole sort of approach I take to Rev Left into all of this stuff. And yeah, some people aren't going to like that. It really bothers some people for some reason. But I think most people understand that this is maturity. This is what adults do. You know, we think through things. We wrestle with complex stuff. We disagree about things, and we can come together as friends and as comrades and disagree about things in a constructive way instead of a destructive way. And hopefully Alyson and I help advance that ethos among the socialist left.
Yeah, that's absolutely the hope. I think that's so important to say. Like, the idea of anyone even just agreeing with us without wrestling with it is disturbing to me,
I agree.
Right?
Yeah.
On the same level as disagreement without wrestling with it. You know, we're just two people, right? Yeah. Like, we are not authorities here, and hopefully, you know, you treat what we have to say as a jumping off point, right? Not as the final statement.
Absolutely. And all I can say, my favorite episodes are these sorts of episodes with Alyson, where we just bounce ideas off each other and wrestle with stuff. It's so fun. And I know for a fact our listeners really love these Red Menace episodes, so we're going to keep them coming. Thank you to everybody who supports the show. We have this idea of trying to tackle the German Revolution soon on Red Menace. We're hesitant to make exact proclamations about when that date will be, but it's something we're working on in the background, so that's going to come, and maybe Alyson and I will touch on something else in between, but we'll come back. We'll have more episodes. Thank you to everybody who listens and supports the show. Love and solidarity.